Now to get warmed up, let's start by creating a simple 3D object here inside of 3D Space. Now it doesn't matter whether we are in the top view, the perspective view, or any of our different views that we have available to us. The actual object creation process is pretty much exactly the same. It's just a difference of what you'll actually see when you click the 3D object out here. And so to begin with, here along the right hand side under our command panel, we'll want to make sure that we are in the Create tab, which is indicated by this little starburst sun looking icon. And then we'll go ahead and start with creating geometry, and you can see that this yellow square is around this circle icon. Now how these tabs actually work is essentially you have one tab along the top, and then you have the different options for what it is that you are trying to do. And so for example, under our Create tab, we have all the different types of things that we can create. Under our Modify tab, this is where the modifiers list is, and we'll talk a lot about modifiers in the coming courses. The Hierarchy tab is predominantly about pivot points, working pivot, and adjusting the transforms, which we'll also talk about soon. You also have the Motion tab, which is essentially for things like trajectories and animation tools, which we won't be covering too extensively here. Next to that, you have the Display tab, which can give you several different customization tools for how you want to showcase the things that you see here in the screen, whether it is the wireframe inherits the object color, material color, and whether when it is shaded it is object color or material color. And we'll talk a lot more about what that actually means. You also have some quick tools for hiding and unhiding, as well as some basic display properties for your objects out here in 3D Space. Lastly, you have the Utilities tab, which has a large set of various different tools, all of which have very different usages throughout what it is that you're trying to do, whether it is camera operations, measuring distances, resetting the X-form, etc. This list here is only some of them, and if you click on the More button here along the top left, this will bring up the full list of all the different utilities. Now there's only a few of them that we'll need to worry about in this course, but you can see the entire list here. We go ahead and left click OK. Let's go ahead and left click back on the Create tab. And under the Create tab you have Geometry, you have Shapes, Lights, Cameras, Helpers, Space Warps, and Systems. For now we want to make sure that we have Geometry highlighted. And just underneath of that, you'll notice that there is this bar here that says Standard Primitives. And if we left click on that, you'll notice there's a whole bunch of other objects and options that we have for different types of geometry that we can create. Whether it's a standard primitive, extended primitive, body objects, doors, etc., etc. And as we click on each of them, you'll notice that new types of objects show up after we select a specific one of these pull-down menus. Now the standard primitives are essentially what you could imagine the majority of shapes starting out as, whether it's a box, a cylinder, a tube, a cone, etc. These are very, very basic shapes, which the majority of the foundation of a lot of the 3D objects that you're going to create all generally start off as these types of shapes. Whether you're creating a simple house with boxes and a pyramid as the roof, for example, if we pull this out, you can imagine the two of these objects conjoining together and you've got your roof and your house. A very, very simple, crude example, but if you can imagine that the majority of the shapes that you come up with, the standard primitives are probably a good starting point. Underneath of that we have the extended primitives, and these are very similar to the standard primitives, only with a few extra features. And so for example, a chamfer box, if we pull this out, this allows us to have a piece of geometry with a little bit softer edges on it. And an oil tank is very similar to a cylinder, only it also has a little bit of a rounded edge to it. And we'll be talking about a lot of these shapes throughout this course, but I wanted you to see sort of the differences between each of these pull-down menus and the different options that you have. So for now, let's start with a standard primitive. We'll go ahead and reset our scene by left-clicking on the 3ds Max icon, hitting Reset, telling it we don't want to save, so go ahead and reset, and clicking our viewport toggle, and we'll start fresh. Making sure that we're on Geometry, Standard Primitives, and we have our objects here, such as boxes and cylinders. Now to begin with, over here where we have our list of primitives, if we start by left-clicking on the one that we want to create, in this case the box, out here in 3D Space, just hold down the left mouse button and start dragging it out. And you'll notice that this creates the base floor for what our box is going to be. And when we release the left mouse button, this allows us to pull the height of the box up and down. And once you find a height that you're happy with, just go ahead and left click again. And that finishes the creation process of that particular primitive. Now you'll notice that our icon on screen is sort of this crosshair T shape, which basically indicates that we are still currently in the creation process. And so, for example, if I quickly drag out another box and another box, we could make as many boxes as we need to by simply dragging them out. Now, when you're ready to exit out of the creation process, you can either left-click on a different shape if you want to switch to a different one, or here inside of 3D Space, once you've created all the boxes that you need, just go ahead and right-click, and that cancels out of the creation process. Now that we've created our box, we can select them by left-clicking on any one of the boxes here inside the viewport. Right now we have 3 separate objects, and any one of these, now that we've made them, we can go back and we can adjust our parameters and sort of make some small tweaks to them if we decide that maybe we want this to be a little taller, a little shorter, and the specific shape that you drag out isn't quite perfect. So to adjust that, here along the command panel, we want to switch over to the Modify tab and go ahead and highlight any one of these boxes. And as we select each of these, you'll notice that our parameters are changing. These are the different parameters for each of the boxes that we have, whether it's the length, the width, or the height. If we select this central yellow box here, we can adjust its length by clicking on the up and down arrow here. These are called spinners. And we can pull it all the way up and down just by holding down the left mouse button. This will increase the length. We can increase the width. And we can increase the height. Say we were doing a floor piece or a small wooden stand. We could start by keeping it really, really thin. Maybe it needs to be a little thicker or thinner. And you can just make these adjustments here inside these parameters. Now underneath of that, you'll see that we have length segments, width segments, and height segments. What this is referring to is if we look at the actual topology of the mesh by pressing the F4 key, this will show us that we have a box made up of these edges that sort of outline the shape that we see. And so here under length segments, we could give them a few more width segments. And if we got really, really close, we could look at it and we could add height segments as well. And while we are doing this, we can always go in and readjust our length, our height, and our width to make it the size that we need. Now, when we're starting with basic primitives, these segments aren't that necessary because we're just going to start with just basic boxes and cylinders, and so this extra topology is not necessary. And when I say topology, that's simply referring to the structure of the static mesh and all of the edges and control points, which we'll be talking about later when we get into editable polygon objects. But for now, with basic primitives, we can go ahead and leave our length segments back to 0, or rather 1, and our width segments down, and our height segments back to 1. And this keeps it as a solid box without all those extra edges that we don't necessarily need right now. Now, once we have our basic box, if we remember to hold down the Alt key and our middle mouse button, we can pan around the scene in 3D Space. We can go into a top view, front view, left view, etc. And you'll see that we now have some 3D objects that we can click on and zoom in on, just like we mentioned earlier. And if we switch back to the perspective view, let's go ahead and pull our camera back. What we can also do from here is we can take advantage of a few other tools other than just the typing parameters here along the right.